The 22nd Amendment, Presidential Term Limits. This is the story of how an unwritten rule controlled the American Republic for 144 years, and how one man's decision to retain power changed the presidency forever. It's 1940. The world is at war. America is barely out of the Great Depression. President Franklin D. Roosevelt is about to do something shocking. He's going to break a sacred tradition that no president before him had successfully broken. He's going to run for a third term. Here's the crazy part. There was nothing legally stopping him. The Constitution said nothing about term limits. The only thing preventing presidents from becoming kings was a custom that started with George Washington. Before getting to Franklin Roosevelt, one needs to understand the power of this tradition. Other presidents had tried to break it before Roosevelt and failed spectacularly. The story begins in September 1796, when George Washington shocked the nation by voluntarily stepping down after 2 terms. This wasn't required by law. He was eligible to remain president until he died. Washington had a particular concern: that Americans might think the presidency was a lifetime appointment, just like the kings they'd fought so hard to escape. In his farewell address, Washington told the country that he had resolved to not run again. His decision created the Washington Precedent, an unwritten rule that set a nearly binding political standard that presidents should serve only 2 terms. For the next 144 years, this tradition held firm. Thomas Jefferson followed it. James Madison followed it. Andrew Jackson followed it. Most presidents respected Washington's example. 2 tried to break it, and their failures show just how powerful this tradition had become. The first was Ulysses S. Grant in 1880. He was a Civil War hero, one of the most popular figures in America. After serving 2 terms, from 1869 to 1877, he wanted to serve a third. Surely his own Republican Party would support him, right? Wrong. The Republicans rejected Grant at their 1880 convention, nominating James Garfield. Grant's military and presidential record couldn't overcome the Washington precedent. Then came Theodore Roosevelt in 1912, and a wild story. Roosevelt had become president in 1901 when President William McKinley was assassinated, then won election in his own right in 1904. Roosevelt honored the Washington precedent by stepping aside in 1908. But in 1912, he did something unprecedented. He came back to challenge the sitting Republican president, William Howard Taft. Roosevelt lost the nomination to Taft at the 1912 Republican Convention. When the Republicans rejected him, Roosevelt did something even more shocking. He founded his own political party, the Progressive Party, nicknamed the Bull Moose Party, because Roosevelt said he felt as strong as a bull moose. The 1912 election results tell the story of how this split the Republican vote. Democrat Woodrow Wilson won with 435 electoral votes and 42% of the popular vote. But here's the kicker. Roosevelt actually beat the incumbent President Taft. Roosevelt got 88 electoral votes and 27% of the vote, while Taft, the sitting president, got only 8 electoral votes and 23% of the vote. Even the socialist candidate Eugene Debs got 6% of the vote. Roosevelt's attempt to break the Washington precedent was so controversial, it threw the entire election into chaos and handed the presidency to the Democrats. These failures actually proved the strength of the Washington precedent. Even very popular politicians like Ulysses Grant and Theodore Roosevelt couldn't overcome it. The tradition was so powerful that it could destroy political careers and split entire political parties. Then came Franklin Roosevelt. The year was 1940, and America was facing its greatest crises since the Civil War. The Great Depression had devastated the economy. Hitler was conquering Europe. Japan was rampaging across Asia. Franklin Roosevelt had already served 2 terms as president. Under normal circumstances, Roosevelt would have stepped aside like most presidents before him, but these weren't normal circumstances. Roosevelt looked at the world situation and made a calculation that would change American history forever. He decided the country needed continuity of leadership more than it needed the 2-term tradition. On November 5, 1940, Roosevelt won an unprecedented 3rd term, but he wasn't done. In 1944, with World War II still raging, he won a fourth term. No president had ever served more than 8 years. Roosevelt served over 12. Roosevelt's decision was completely constitutional. The Constitution didn't forbid it. The only thing stopping him was tradition, and Roosevelt had decided that tradition was less important than maintaining power during a crisis. Roosevelt's unprecedented hold on power concerned many people. The concern was that if extraordinary circumstances could break a 144-year tradition once, it could happen again. What if the next president to break the Washington precedent wasn't facing a depression and a world war? What if the only motivation was power? Roosevelt died in office in April 1945, just months into his fourth term. Harry Truman became president and won election in his own right in 1948. In 1947, Republicans had regained control of Congress, and they were determined that no president would ever accumulate Roosevelt's kind of power again. The solution was the 22nd Amendment, and it moved through Congress with remarkable speed. Originally proposed in the House on February 6, 1947, Congress sent the proposed amendment to the states for ratification on March 21, 1947. The proposed amendment's language was very specific. It states, "No person shall be elected to the office of the President more than twice, and no person who has held the office of President or acted as President for more than 2 years of a term to which some other person was elected President shall be elected to the office of President more than once." Notice that key word, elected. The amendment doesn't say presidents can't serve more than 2 terms, or that they're ineligible for the office. It specifically says they can't be elected more than twice. The amendment included an exemption for Harry Truman. Since he was president when the amendment was ratified, it did not apply to him. Truman actually considered running in 1952, but after losing the New Hampshire primary, he decided to retire instead. This meant Dwight Eisenhower became the first president restricted by the 22nd Amendment. Eisenhower hated it, not because he wanted a third term, but because he understood something crucial about presidential power. The moment a president starts a second term, everyone knows he can never run again, becoming a lame duck and weakening the president's political authority. Since then, 7 presidents have been elected twice. Eisenhower, Nixon, who resigned during his second term, Reagan, Clinton, George W. Bush, Obama, and now Donald Trump, who's currently serving his second non-consecutive term. Now this story gets fascinating for the current moment and President Trump. President Trump's election to a third term requires an amendment to repeal or modify the 22nd Amendment, following the challenging process of Article 5. Tennessee Congressman Andy Ogles has proposed just such an amendment. For this to be successful, requires votes by 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of the states. There's a seldom discussed constitutional loophole involving the vice presidency and the exact wording of 2 amendments. The 12th Amendment, passed in 1804, contains this specific language about vice presidential eligibility. But no person constitutionally ineligible to the office of president shall be eligible to that of vice president of the United States. Remember that the 22nd Amendment says, no person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice. Now the constitutional puzzle becomes clear. The 12th Amendment says anyone who is constitutionally ineligible to the office of president cannot be vice president. But does the 22nd Amendment's restriction on being elected president more than twice make someone elected 2 times constitutionally ineligible to the office of president? And if so, would that prevent him from being vice president? Here's the million-dollar question. If Donald Trump can't be elected president again under the 22nd Amendment, does that make him constitutionally ineligible to the office of president under the 12th Amendment? Constitutional scholars are genuinely divided on this. Some argue that since Trump can't be elected president again, he's constitutionally ineligible for the presidency and therefore can't be vice president. Others argue that Trump still meets all the original Article 2 requirements for the presidency. He's over 35, he's a natural-born citizen, he's lived in the U.S. for 14 years, and the 22nd Amendment only restricts election, not eligibility for the office itself. The distinction matters because there are ways to become president without being elected. President Gerald Ford was never elected as either president or vice president. If a vice president succeeds to the presidency due to death, resignation, or removal, they're not being elected to the office. They're assuming it through constitutional succession. Ultimately, if a twice-elected former president seeks to become vice president, either by election or appointment under the 25th Amendment, the Supreme Court will need to resolve the issues involving the 12th and 22nd Amendments. The 22nd Amendment represents one of the most dramatic transformations in American political history. It took an informal tradition that had governed the presidency for nearly a century and a half and made it constitutional law. Washington's voluntary decision to step down became so powerful that it survived multiple challenges over 144 years, only to be broken by the extraordinary circumstances of Depression and World War. Roosevelt's 4 elections forced the country to confront a fundamental question about the American Republic. How does a nation prevent the concentration of power without restricting the people's right to choose their leaders? The 22nd Amendment was America's answer. No president, no matter how popular or how dire the circumstances, could be elected more than twice. The 22nd Amendment stands as both a protection against consolidation of power and a limitation on electoral choice. It's a reminder that in America, the presidency is a temporary job, not a permanent throne. That 2-term tradition started with George Washington and is now written into the Constitution, ensuring that no future president can accumulate the kind of power that Franklin Roosevelt wielded for over 12 years. The Washington precedent has become the supreme law of the land. Thanks for watching. Combat constitutional illiteracy. Subscribe to this channel.